There is a newspaper clipping from Circleville, Ohio, dated October 14th, 1889. It is 3 paragraphs long. 2 of those paragraphs describe the crowd, the weather, and the price of admission. The 3rd paragraph is different. The 3rd paragraph describes what happened when the giant spoke. The editor of the Circleville Union Herald, a man named Thomas Aldridge, wrote this: "The creature, for we know not what else to call him, turned his face toward the eastern field and released a sound from his throat that silenced every man, woman, and child present. It was language, we do not know whose." That clipping exists, or rather, it existed. The library that held it in microfilm reported a gap in their 1889 archives in 1953. The gap covers exactly 6 weeks, October through mid-November. This is where we begin. The Showman. His name was Colonel Jedediah Marsh. He was not a real colonel. That title was purchased in 1871 from a theatrical outfitter in Cincinnati for $3 and a handshake. But the title stuck because Marsh understood something about human psychology that most people in his era were only beginning to articulate. People believe what they are invited to believe. Marsh ran what he called the Continental Curiosities Exhibition. It was not Barnum. It was not the travelling circus of illustrated posters and elephant dung. Marsh's operation was quieter, more deliberate, and by most accounts far more unsettling. He travelled a specific circuit: rural Ohio, southern Indiana, the edges of Kentucky, back through Pennsylvania, and then west again. He did this every year from 1874 to 1891. He never went to New York. He never went to Chicago. He stayed in the smaller places, the towns that still had fresh memory of mound builders, the towns built on top of earthworks nobody had explained yet. He travelled with 7 wagons. 6 carried the standard catalogue of the era: a 2-headed calf preserved in spirits, a collection of Moorish coins, likely medieval European, a Louisiana fortune-teller, and a mechanical bird that sang when you cranked a handle on its back. The 7th wagon was different. The 7th wagon was larger than the others, reinforced with iron bands along the base, always positioned at the rear. No windows. Ventilation slats near the roof cut at an angle so the interior could not be seen from outside. The lock was unlike any witnesses had encountered. A sliding mechanism Marsh operated with a key on a cord around his neck. When the convoy stopped in a town, the 7th wagon was always parked last. Set-up was done around it, and the giant came out at dusk. Who the giant was? We do not know his real name. Marsh called him Goliath in the promotional handbills, which were printed on yellow paper and distributed in the days before arrival. The handbills read, "Goliath, the last living giant of the ancient races, 7 feet 9 inches of living history. Come and see what the history books have hidden from you." That last line. Come and see what the history books have hidden from you. In 1874, that was a carnival pitch. In 2024, that sentence reads differently. Witnesses across multiple towns described the giant consistently. He was genuinely enormous, not the fraudulent giants of the era. The Cardiff giant had been exposed as a hoax in 1869, and audiences were sceptical. This was a living person who stood by measurement taken by a physician in Chillicothe in 1881 at 7 feet and 11 inches in his bare feet. Dr. Harlan Reeves wrote in his personal journal, Patch, donated to the Ross County Historical Society in 1947 by his granddaughter, that the giant's bone structure was unlike any he had encountered. The orbital ridges were pronounced to a degree that no current medical literature accounts for. The hands measured 9¼ inches across the palm. He was not deformed. Reeves was explicit. His proportions were harmonious, as if the whole of him had simply been constructed at a larger scale. Not acromegaly, not any condition Reeves could name. The giant had a reddish-brown complexion. His hair was dark, straight, and worn long. His eyes were described differently by different witnesses. Some said dark brown, others said they appeared almost amber in firelight. He was not, as far as anyone could determine, a prisoner. He did not appear to be restrained. He travelled willingly with Marsh, or at minimum he travelled without resistance. Several witnesses attempted to speak to him privately, away from Marsh's supervision, and reported that he listened carefully but did not respond in any language they recognized. What Marsh said about him. Marsh gave different stories to different audiences. To a Methodist congregation in Springfield in 1878, he said the giant was a descendant of the race mentioned in Genesis 6, the Nephilim. To a Masonic lodge in Columbus, he called him a survivor of the pre-Adamic civilizations whose ruins lie beneath every major river valley in this continent. To journalists, he said only that he had found the man in a rural area west of the Urals in 1873. West of the Urals. That phrase appears in at least 3 separate newspaper interviews across different years. West of the Urals encompasses the dissolving outer boundary of the Great Tartary, the territory labelled in cartographic tradition stretching back to the 16th century as Tartaria, a name that does not appear in our standard histories, a name attached to a civilization whose cities, whose infrastructure, whose very existence was systematically removed from the cartographic record across a 40-year period in the mid-19th century, west of the Urals. Marsh knew what he was saying. The circuit and the pattern between 1874 and 1889, the Continental Curiosities exhibition, made documented stops in at least 43 towns across Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania. This is what survives in local newspaper archives, church records, and the diaries of people who wrote about what they saw. A pattern emerges in that documentation. Marsh did not choose his stopping points randomly. He was not following trade roads or the logic of population density. Plot the confirmed stops on a map of Ohio, and you will see it immediately. Marsh's circuit traces, with remarkable fidelity, the known distribution of the Adena and Hopewell earthwork sites. The mound complexes, the geometric enclosures whose purpose remains officially classified as ceremonial because we have no better word for them. Newark Earthworks Mound City, Seep Earthwork, the Serpent Mound in Adams County. Marsh stopped within 10 miles of the Serpent Mound in 1876, 1880, 1884 and 1888, 4 times in 12 years. No town of any commercial significance was near those stops. The handbills for those visits have never been found. On the morning after each, witnesses reported the giant was quieter than usual. One woman near Bainbridge wrote in 1884 that he sat at the edge of the wagon and looked toward the hill for 2 hours without speaking. The Serpent Mound sits on a hill. Circleville, Ohio, October 1889. Circleville was built on a mound complex. The original town plan, laid out in 1810, was designed in a circle to follow the circumference of an ancient earthwork that had stood on that site for at least 2,000 years. By 1889, most of the earthwork had been demolished. The circle was still there, faintly, in the street layout. Marsh arrived on October 12th. The handbills had come 2 days before, the usual yellow paper, the usual promises. By the evening of the 14th, a crowd of somewhere between 200 and 300 people had gathered in the field south of the old circular street. The night was cold. There were lanterns. Marsh's wagons were arranged in a semicircle with the 7th wagon, as always, at the rear. The performance proceeded normally. The 2-headed calf, the Moorish coins, the fortune teller, the mechanical bird. And then, at approximately 8:30 in the evening, Marsh unlocked the 7th wagon and the giant stepped out. Thomas Aldridge of the Union Herald described what he saw in the clipping we already mentioned. A woman named Constance Feller also wrote a letter to her sister in Columbus 3 days later, transcribed by researcher Daniel Hoole in 2009 before the original was sold at auction to an unknown buyer. Constance Feller wrote, "He came out of the wagon and he stood in the lantern light, and he was the most real thing I have ever seen. Frightening in the way that a fact is frightening when you have been told all your life it was not a fact. He stood on a wooden platform Marsh had assembled, roughly 2 feet high, which was unnecessary. Even without the platform, he stood above every person present. Marsh spoke for 10 minutes about his origins, his diet, his temperament. The crowd watched. The giant stood, And then he turned east. There was no instruction from Marsh. Marsh, according to Aldrich, appeared startled. The giant turned to face the eastern end of the field, and he opened his mouth, and he spoke. What he said, 3 witnesses transcribed it phonetically. A newspaper editor, a housewife, and a 14-year-old boy named George Pittman, who wrote it down in a school notebook with a pencil. The 3 transcriptions do not match perfectly, taken in panic, in low light, by people who had never heard anything like it. But they overlap enough that researchers working outside academic channels agree. It was language, not gibberish, not glossolalia, language. What kind of language is a more complicated question. The phonetic transcription that has received the most attention is George Pittman's. His family kept the notebook until his death in 1952, after which it passed to a local historical society where it sat uncatalogued for 31 years. A volunteer archivist made a photocopy in 2004 before the original was lost in a records reorganization. The photocopy has circulated in certain research communities since 2006. The sounds Pittman wrote down include sequences researchers have compared to reconstructed Proto-Turkic, archaic Persian, and a debated linguistic substrate underlying place names of the Tartarian heartland before the cartographic erasure. What has been proposed tentatively by at least 2 independent researchers is that recurring sound clusters in Pittman's transcription match root words from very old place name records of the Central Eurasian steppe. Names that predate the Russian cartographic revision of the 1840s through 1880s, during which Tartarian nomenclature was systematically replaced with Russian and European names on official maps. He was not speaking English. He was not speaking German or French or Russian or any Native American language that contemporaneous witnesses might have recognized. He was speaking something that Thomas Aldrich called the tongue of a people we do not have a name for. We do have a name for them. We have a name that we were encouraged very deliberately to stop using. What happened after Marsh did not stay in Circleville? By noon on October 15th, the convoy was gone. The Union Herald published Aldrich's 3 paragraphs on the 16th. According to letters Aldrich sent to a friend in Zanesville, donated to the Ohio History Center in 1961, 2 men visited him 2 days after publication. They did not identify their employer. They asked for any notes or additional material. He had nothing to give them. His notes were published. He had no photograph, no recording. They left. The archive gap appeared in 1953, 64 years later. Whether those 2 events are connected is a question for which we have no evidence either way. Marsh's exhibition continued into 1890 and 1891. And then it stopped. There is no record of Marsh after 1891. No death record, no probate, no sale of property. He does not appear in the 1900 census. He does not appear anywhere. The giant does not appear anywhere after October 14th, 1889. What this means, if it means anything. Here is what the standard history gives us. The giant was probably a person with a rare growth condition recruited from Eastern Europe and exploited for profit. The words he shouted were probably in an undocumented language. The archive gap was probably a records failure. Marsh's disappearance was probably the quiet end of a broke carnival operator. That is the version that requires no adjustment to anything we think we know. Here is the other version. A man whose skeleton was built at a scale medicine cannot account for, brought from the heartland of a civilization being erased from maps at the time of his arrival in America, who navigated to ancient earthwork sites with apparent purpose, and who spoke in a language connecting in fragments to that erased civilization. That man stood in a field in Ohio in 1889 and said something. He turned east, not randomly. He turned to a specific direction, and he spoke. The people who heard it said it did not sound like pain or performance. It sounded, in the words of Constance Feller, like someone saying a name, not any one person's name, a place. The name of a place. We do not know what place. We do not know what language. We do not know what he was trying to tell the 200 people who stood in the cold in Circleville, Ohio, on the site of a demolished earthwork, looking up at him in the lantern light. We know that someone, at some point, decided that 3 paragraphs in a small Ohio newspaper were worth 6 weeks of archival silence. We know that Marsh chose his circuit with a precision that does not look accidental in retrospect. We know that the giant is not in any record after that night. And we know, because Constance Feller wrote it to her sister, and her sister kept the letter, and the letter survived, that as the giant stepped back toward the 7th wagon, he stopped once. He turned back to the crowd, and he looked at them for a long moment, not performing, not posturing, just looking. She wrote, "He looked at us the way you look at someone you will not see again, the way you look when you want to remember a face." Then he went inside. The lock slid shut, and by morning the wagons were gone. Whatever he was saying, he said it in Circleville. Whatever he knew it. And somewhere in the record, in the space between what was written and what was removed, the answer is still there. We just have not found it yet.